So I was a fan of the first 28 Years Later movie, and I was excited to see the sequel, but wow, I didn't expect it to be this good. Despite not seeing much infected, in fact, most of the infected arrived in the early part of the movie. Within this one, we got a deeper look into how mental illness was just as damaging as the rage virus if left untreated. We had the reveal of the rage virus actually being a mental illness and it clouding the brain rather than it taking it over, loneliness taking hold, and we also saw a point of view from the infected which shone a light on how they perceived the world. With an ending which showed that the one man that had the potential to save it was taken out, let's dive into this movie, break down the ending, Cillian Murphy's scene, and I'll also share what I thought of it. Here is 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, ending explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The ending explained. The ending of this episode bridged the three different stories together in the most perfect way. We saw the Jimmies, which was headed up by Jack O'Connell, essentially getting called out on his bluff in believing that Old Nick, Satan, was talking to him when Kelly told him that she saw Old Nick dancing around the Bone Temple with an alpha. But in actuality, it was Dr Ian Kelson who'd been working on a cure for the rage virus on Samson the alpha, who'd essentially become addicted to opioids. As well as that, we also saw that Samson had begun to not only serve as an infected that Dr. Kelson could test his experiments on, but he also acted as company, something that it was clear to see Kelson had grown to want after all of this time on his own. Let's first start by looking at the Kelson and Samson storyline. The importance of this storyline in the trilogy of films is that Samson ultimately ended up being cured. It was mentioned by Kelson that he had a theory that the rage virus could be something that hung over the brain like a cloud and caused the infected to act differently, warping their perception of what they see. He believed it could have been that rather than it completely taking over their mind and causing irreparable damage. We got a glimpse of the point of view of the Alpha earlier on in the movie where he killed the Explorer. He viewed the regular human being as a monster, and we also heard that the sounds of the world, nature, the wind blowing and the birds tweeting were replaced with harsh droning sounds and intense wind. There was an intensity in the mind of the infected, which was what caused them to act so irrational. The fact that they viewed regular people as monsters as well, that justified why there was no limit when it came to the type of person that they tried to infect, from young right the way up to old. Samson had become conditioned to understanding what Kelson was doing and the feeling that he'd get when morphine would enter his system, and the desire for that feeling outweighed the rage that the infection was channeling through his blood. This is why Kelson was able to get so close to him. As time went on and as Kelson became to look deeper into what was going on in Samson's mind, he was working on a different type of drug that could potentially allow Samson to be free of the virus. Kelson believed that it was a form of psychosis, and 20 years prior to that, before the rage virus broke out, psychosis would be treated. This is why Kelson gave Samson the 2 tablets to swallow. Kelson was actually going to put Samson to sleep for good at one point because there were no signs of progress that his experiments were working, but as he was about to do so, Samson was looking up at the moon and said, "Moon." This was the first word that he would have spoken in 28 years. This also showed that when Samson had the morphine within his system, the words that Dr. Kelson was speaking to him were penetrating through the virus and going into his mind. When Samson went off after taking the tablets, we heard his perspective of the world again, and it was completely different. He could hear the wind, the birds, and the beauty of nature. He was also having memories coming back to him, memories of the train that he was on, which was when I imagine he became infected. He sat down on it, and as he did, he saw himself as a kid again, reading a book about the moon. As he then snapped back into reality, he saw that all of the infected were looking at him and getting ready to attack. This showed that he didn't have the virus present within him at that moment, and they could tell that he didn't, so they started to attack him. But with him being a giant force, he got himself out of there with ease. This was massive though, because it means that Dr. Kelson had essentially created a cure for the rage virus. Samson now had his own thoughts, he could speak, and he was in control of his own body. The rage virus couldn't be detected at all, nor could it infect him again. This also gave us the biggest reveal in the entire franchise, that the rage virus is something that clouds the mind and doesn't look to replace it, it just covers over what's there rather than infects it from within. When going back to the Bone Temple, Jimmy's fingers had been getting smaller and smaller due to Kelly not believing in Jimmy's prophecy and Spike looking to flee because, to be frank, he was pretty useless. However, when Jimmy approached Kelson and told him to put on a show and pretend to be Old Nick, otherwise he'd kill him, Kelson agreed to do so. It was during this moment where Kelson went along with the plan and put on the spectacle, which was absolutely epic to watch, and everybody believed that he was Satan on Earth. He was simply acting as the puppet of Jimmy and serving them commandments, such as allowing them to go and give charity to anybody that they deemed worthy of receiving it, and to also grow the fingers to more than one hand, but to hundreds if need be. This was because Jimmy could sense that the support within them was wavering and the confidence in him was drifting too. You could tell that Kelson was uncomfortable in agreeing to do this, but he knew that in order to survive, he had to. It was only when Kelson saw that it was Spike behind the eyes of the mask where he passed one final commandment onto Jimmy, one that he didn't plan, and that was that he needed to be crucified as a sacrifice, just like what happened with Jesus Christ. This was going to be Kelson's way of getting Jimmy and his fingers to dismantle and no longer cause a reign of terror over the area. However, Jimmy turned on Kelson and proved to the group that he actually wasn't Old Nick by wounding him. Kelly was ready to get Jimmy and she took out the others, but Spike was the person that delivered the fatal blow to Jimmy by doing to him what he did to Kelson. Memento Mori was the very thing that was at the heart of this movie again. Remember, you must die. And Kelson, having completed his work of finding a cure, something that he didn't know at that point, felt he'd done all that he could whilst seeking haven in his Temple of Bones. Kelson did that because he felt like Spike had suffered enough with him losing his mother, and even if it meant being killed, he wanted to speak out against Jimmy so that Spike would have the opportunity of being free. If this were to be his time, then so be it. Memento Mori. Both Kelly and Spike walked out of the Temple of Bones whilst leaving Jimmy on the upside-down cross. Jimmy was crying for his mother, and for the first time we saw true fear in his eyes. We got a glimpse of it when he first walked through the Temple of Bones, but here he was now, ready to meet his maker. As Samson appeared, Jimmy believed that it was Satan himself, his father, coming to take him away, but he never did. Instead, he ended up being killed by a different type of infected. The way that Kelson was sitting with his head up against the skulls, it was so powerful. He said to himself how his bone temple was almost like a graveyard as it was there to honor the dead, and there his head was, fitting in perfectly into a gap between the skulls. It was a shot that I thought was just absolutely gorgeous. I also thought that it was quite powerful, the way that when Samson approached Kelson, he thanked him, and the camera then changed its perspective and moved to a bird's eye view of the ring of fire that was surrounding them. It was almost symbolizing how the man and the cure would live and die inside of that ring. The man who essentially dedicated those years in isolation to looking for a way to solve the issue that plagued the world found it, but the brain behind it wasn't going to survive. There was a sense of despair because the world was so close to being cured, but now they're right back to square one. The character Jimmy was a really interesting one to have in the movie because what it basically showed us was that he was severely mentally ill with what he saw in believing that his father was commanding the infected in the church when in actual fact he was killed. The fact that he was also left alone as a child, and also that he believed that he was the son of God. Satan. When he told Dr. Kelson that he heard his father talking to him but never saw him, it showed just how mentally ill he was. There were parallels with the rage virus and the fact that, like Samson, Jimmy showed signs of psychosis and was just as damaging to the people trying to survive as what the infected were. However, as we saw with Jimmy, he wasn't able to be saved. It's kind of similar to how Major Henry West was utilized in the first movie 28 Days Later as being far more threatening than the actual infected. Cillian Murphy's scene. Right after we saw Jimmy being killed and Dr. Kelson being taken away by Samson, it cut to the house that seemed to be recognizable from the ending of 28 Days Later. What we saw was that Jim was still alive and he was there, and he now had a daughter. Selena wasn't there though, but one would have to assume that maybe she could have been out somewhere else, or maybe she died in the process. We also didn't see Hannah either, which I'm quite glad about because she wasn't a very well performed character at all of those years ago. Jim's daughter was studying the difference in repercussions on Germany in the Second World War versus the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles' punishing nature versus the more helping hand post the Second World War with the Marshall Plan. They also quoted Churchill, which was, "Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it." This was then when both Spike and Kelly were seen in the distance by Jim and his daughter, and she asked him if they were going to help them. Jim responded to her and said, of course. This bridges the beginning of the final installment of the trilogy right the way back to where it all started with 28 Days Later, and also with two incredible actors like Ralph Fiennes and Jack O'Connell leaving it. It now allows room for a great like Cillian Murphy to take the lead in this universe again. I feel with Jim saying, of course, it connects back to the helping hand that they were discussing about what could potentially arise in his daughter's exam and the quote from Churchill. He remembers how he was helped along the way 28 days later, so he's not going to allow them to die or become a figure like Major Henry West. My review of the movie. Honestly, I can't fault this movie in any way whatsoever. I thought it was absolutely incredible. From the moment that it opened up with the scene in the swimming pool, it set the dark backdrop to what we were going to get for the 1 hour and 50-minute runtime. Despite never really spending that much time with the infected in this movie, I feel like I saw some of the most horror-filled moments in a movie in such a long time. When the Jimmies were just flaying people in the barn and slicing them in any way whatsoever, it was absolutely brutal and I felt like I needed to look away at points. I kinda liked the way that we didn't focus on the people just running away from a swarm of infected throughout the entirety of it. We had a bit of it in the opening part of the movie, but we got a lot of that in the first one, so I preferred the more intimate approach in looking inside the lonely mind of Dr. Kelson, understanding the rage virus that little bit more because we'd never really seen it, and also the parallels with the Jimmies. Jack O'Connell is definitely proving himself to be one of Britain's finest actors at the moment. As Jimmy, he commanded every scene and drew me into every word he said. The menacing nature and the almost joy and pleasure that he got from giving people charity, but not the charity that you and I are thinking of. It was horrific. He was a truly frightening man, and watching him cower at the end and beg for his mother was something that brought a kind of satisfaction. He was now in a position that he'd essentially put all of his victims in. Now, never did I think that I'd be on the cusp of welling up during a 28 Years Later movie, but there I was at the end of this one, feeling like I wanted to wipe a tear away from my eye. When Samson walked through the Temple of Bones after Kelson drew his last breath and he thanked him, it was a moment that just felt so wholesome, and the level of care that Kelson had really cut through. He was just a caring man, and we saw it with Spike and also with Samson. One thing that I really respected about this film too was that it condensed the story into such a digestible runtime. It didn't push it over 2 hours, it left it there at about 1 hour 50 including credits. It didn't drag, it didn't try to make it something that it wasn't. It gave us everything that it needed to in the most efficient time possible. As good as Jack O'Connell was, Ralph Fiennes matched it. The scene that they both shared where they were by the lake was one of my favourites in the movie. You could tell the game that they were both playing and that Kelson wasn't frightened of the man that usually inflicted fear into everybody that he was around. I also thought the tender moments that he had with Samson were some of my favourites too. The photos that he had on his wall in his bunker of his life before brought a sense of normality to the character, a normality that gets lost by the iodine-tainted skin and the castle of bones that surrounds him. One thing I do want to say is how utterly useless is Spike. I get that it's the point of the character to not truly fit in, but my god, he couldn't even kill an infected in an efficient way. He's so useless to the point where it becomes frustrating to watch. I did like the moment though where he looked up at the Bone Temple and you could tell that he was acknowledging that his mother's skull was there, almost watching over him and judging. On Letterboxd, I gave this movie 5 stars. It's my first 5 stars of probably only a few of the year, but I feel like it thoroughly deserves it. I strongly recommend giving this one a watch. You most definitely won't regret it. I think it tops the first 28 Years Later for me. So, there you have it. 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, ending explained.